Good afternoon and welcome to the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation's webinar, When Should Genetic Testing Be Repeated? My name is Leah Mumm, and I am the Patient and Physician Support Coordinator for the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation. We would like to take a moment to recognize our corporate sponsor, Tenaya Therapeutics, for sponsoring today's webinar and for their generous and ongoing support of our webinar program and work at CCF. The Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation, CCF, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to finding causes and cures for pediatric cardiomyopathy through the support of research, education, awareness, and advocacy. Established in 2002, CCF has grown into a global community of families, physicians, and scientists focused on improving diagnosis, treatment, and quality of life for children with cardiomyopathy. During today's webinar, questions are encouraged and welcomed. Questions may be submitted via the question box located in the control panel on your screen. We will reserve the last 10 minutes of our time for questions. You are welcome to submit your questions throughout the presentation as you think of them, and we will go through them at the conclusion of the talk. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the CCF website and YouTube channel in the coming days. We are thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Teresa Lee. Dr. Lee is an assistant professor of pediatric cardiology at Columbia University Medical Center. She is board certified in pediatric cardiology with advanced training in heart failure, transplantation, and clinical genetics. As a physician scientist, her research is focused on identifying novel genetic causes of cardiomyopathies in children. Her current research focus under CTSA Irving Institute Transform K-12 Award and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute K-23 Award has been the identification of novel genetic causes for infantile cardiomyopathy. With the support of CCF funding, she is currently studying the downstream effects of novel cardiomyopathy genes to better understand the molecular changes that result in heart failure using induced pluripotent stem cells and mouse models of cardiomyopathy. She is also a member of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute-funded Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry and is actively involved in the research efforts to understand the genetic causes of cardiomyopathy in the pediatric age group. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for joining us. We are pleased to have you. I will now turn things over to Dr. Lee, who will begin today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Leah, for having me, and thank you to the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation. It's always great to be with you, and I'm really happy that we get to spend this next hour together talking about what I think is a really important topic. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my slides. Okay, great. Okay, so the focus of today's talk is really for our patients and our parents to talk about when should genetic testing be repeated. And we're going to go through 3 objectives in the next 45 minutes or so. And I want to first just make sure that we are all on the same page. And so I'm going to review some of the basic terminology. And then I know that a lot of you are really savvy parents and that you've been talking to your doctors about this in the office, but we want to just review the current recommendations for genetic testing in children with cardiomyopathy. And then mostly we want to focus on some of the newer recommendations that have come out in terms of when should some of these test results be revisited. Okay, so first I want to review some of the basic terminology because it's actually quite confusing, even for those of us that do this on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so let's talk about changes in our DNA. So as we all know, our DNA is the basic instructions for our body. And so when we have what's called wild type or a healthy genetic sequence, that is the normal genetic sequence. And the way that I usually explain it is it's sort of like the regular sequence. And what we're essentially doing when you're getting genetics testing done is we are just going through and we are just proofreading that sequence to see if there's a change from what we know is supposed to be the normal or the healthy sequence. So if you look at the bottom panel, you can see that where there used to be a G, there is now a single substitution of a C. And so that would be what we consider a genetic mistake or a typo. And basically, the reason why that's important is that you can see that that single change in a C at the DNA level actually changes the protein from a lysine to an asparagine. And that's what's important. And that's what we talk about when we talk about different genetic changes. Now, this gets a little bit more complicated because that doesn't always mean that that change necessarily is something that causes a disease. So now we're going to take it one step further and add a layer of complexity. So this is just what we're doing when we are doing the basic sequencing of your DNA. And I simplified it because there's actually lots of different types of changes that can happen in your DNA, but we just did one where there's just a simple typo where you substitute one letter for a different letter. Okay, so this is where it gets really complicated. And so this is where interpreting those changes can be a challenge. So just to go back for 1 second. So I want to say that we are extremely good at doing this part of the technology. So we're really accurate and we're very good at this part, which is called the sequencing or the proofreading of your DNA. And so in today's technology, there's very few mistakes that are actually made. And so this part is done relatively easily. It's done relatively quickly. And this is actually one of the reasons why we've been able to offer genetic testing. And also this is one of the reasons why we've been able to have, you've probably noticed that there's more and more genes that we're able to test for, or we're even to do things now like test for all of the proteins that are encoded, or to even sequence a person's complete human DNA makeup and to sequence the complete human genome. And the reason for that is because we've gotten very good at this technology. Okay, so this is the part that we're struggling with. So even though we know the specific changes, we don't know if those changes are necessarily associated with the disease that we are concerned about. And so the disease that we are concerned about in this instance is cardiomyopathy. So you can see in this slide, there are currently 5 different categories whenever we notice that there's a genetic change. And we've also a lot of times use the word mutation just because it's a word that we commonly understand. But when you really talk to different people and we talk to scientists, we are trying not to use that word quite as much because a lot of times when you say mutation, that tends to in our minds mean that that genetic change is associated with disease or it's associated with a protein that doesn't work correctly. So what we have learned over time as we've done more and more sequencing is that always isn't correct. And so the correct word that we now use is a change in your DNA is called a variation or a variant. And then what we have to figure out is, okay, what does that variant actually mean? And there are currently 5 different categories. And those 5 categories, and this is all done by the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics and the American Medical Pathology Institute. And so the different categories are pathogenic, likely pathogenic, a variant of uncertain significance, which we'll talk about a little bit more, likely benign or benign. So those are the 5 major categories that we currently can define what these sequence variants mean. Now, just to show you, so there's a genetic testing company called Myriad Genetics. That's one that's commonly more used in the cancer world. So for our parents here today, that's not one that you've commonly heard of. So this, a lot of these slides are actually taken from breast cancer testing companies because they were one of the first companies to come out. And so you can see that back a couple of years ago that they use different terms. And so, for example, pathogenic used to be called deleterious. And so you can see that even within the genetic community and even amongst testing companies, that there was a lot of different terminology that made things more confusing. Not everyone had 5 categories. Everyone had different words. And so again, these two associations, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics and the Association for Molecular Pathology, in 2015 put together guidelines because this was obviously something that was of much concern. The genetics community, clinicians, physicians, and also patients were all getting confused. And so they finally put together standards and guidelines for how we should interpret these variants. And so when they did this in 2015, what we noticed was that some of the older test results had changes because they finally kind of set together a standard of guidelines and gave us a rule of thumb for how we should be interpreting some of these variants. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but I'm happy to take questions at the end because I know that's sort of something that's confusing. But what I hope you take away from this is that, yes, when we do your genetic testing, we know that we can tell with pretty much certainty if there is a change that exists. But what is really not a black and white definitive answer is what that necessarily means. And so I'm going to really quickly review genetic testing recommendations for children with cardiomyopathy, but then I want to get to the meat of our discussion, which is really when should genetic testing results be revisited. And I want to make sure that we have a lot of time to have questions and to have a discussion, because I think that's where we can really get to the meat of some of this. Okay, so just to give us all a reminder, we now know that especially in pediatric cardiomyopathy, the disease of the heart muscle, that along with getting the clinical evaluation that you're getting with your cardiologist, and those are things like the EKG and the echocardiogram that you're getting, that a lot of times genetic testing, looking at the DNA, can be really, really helpful. And the reason why that can be so helpful is because we know that the vast majority of cases of pediatric cardiomyopathy, but all different types of cardiomyopathy, are actually caused by genetic changes. There are multiple reasons why that's important. One of the common reasons that parents and different patients are especially telling us is that they want to know if the reason why their child has cardiomyopathy is genetic, is that it's really important information for them to help, one, take care of other family members, to know if they themselves, the parents, might be at risk, if their other children are at risk. This can also go on to grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. It also can help them decide about future children. So maybe they're thinking about adding another child to their family, and they want to know if that baby could potentially also be at risk to be born with cardiomyopathy. So these are some things that are really important for the family. They also want to know how do we take care of the children? Should they be screened? Should they also be getting EKGs? Who in the family needs to be getting this testing? And so a lot of times getting genetic testing can help you identify who at the family may be at risk if you know what causes the disease in the person in your family who has it. The other thing that can be sometimes helpful is that a lot of times you're getting the diagnosis and it's obviously very overwhelming. And the first question that a lot of families also have is, well, how is my child going to do? How are they going to do in terms of their overall life? Are they going to need to be on medications for their whole life? What does it look like? What's the disease severity? Are there other things that we need to worry about? Could they have heart rhythm issues? So can they have an arrhythmia, for example? Could there be other body organs that are affected? So are there other things that we should be looking at? So a lot of times if you have a genetic cause, knowing the particular gene that is causing the heart disease may tell you, for example, the same gene that's causing the heart muscle disease also affects your leg muscles. And so that may be something that's really important. And so maybe it's important to also see different doctors as well. And then one of the other reasons that it's increasingly becoming important is that every single day there are new medications that are either being studied or coming out on the market that are available. And a lot of those medicines are what we call precision medicines. So these medications are either targeted towards more the root cause of what is causing your child's cardiomyopathy, or a lot of times there are current drug trials, clinical trials that are actually looking to try to fix the root cause. So there are either gene-based trials, and then there's some studies looking at if there can be actual ways to maybe potentially correct the genetic mistake. And so those are all things that are likely going to be within the lifespan of your child that are likely going to be available. Some of them, there are studies that you can talk to your cardiologist about. Some of them are in very, very early stages where they're just gathering data, trying to understand the disease. Some of them are in adult trials. There's not very many that are quite in pediatric trials yet, but if you keep looking, they're sort of on the horizon. And so that could be another reason why knowing your child's genetic cause is important, because it may qualify them for some of these newer treatments that are coming out. Okay, so let's discuss some of the specifics in terms of genetic testing, and when should you review or revisit or maybe potentially get retested. So this is a paper that recently came out, and I really want to highlight that this was work that we were able to do through the Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry in conjunction with support from the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation. And so it was really through their support and through parents like yourself who were willing to enroll in studies. So there are lots of different centers across the United States and Canada that children were a part of. And so this was really helpful for us to understand, particularly in pediatric cardiomyopathy, the significance of that initial 2015 guidelines that came out. So what we wanted to basically do was we wanted to see, with those guidelines that came out in 2015 that I spoke about, if we were to take patients that had agreed to enroll in a research study, and we looked at 37 cardiomyopathy genes that we had analyzed through our testing and research, and we knew that 211 children had had genetic testing at a commercial genetic testing company prior to being enrolled and consented into our research study. And so we wanted to compare those results and see if there had been changes when we were looking at the new interpretation of those sequence variants. And so again, there was not a whole lot of change in terms of the actual readout, in terms of the actual genetic change, but we wanted to see if there would be actually a change in terms of how we interpreted those variants. Okay, so I apologize because I know that this is a really fuzzy slide, but this was the best one that I could find. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Again, this is from a cancer website, but this was one of the ones that I thought summarized it the best that I have seen. So if you remember before, I said that there were 5 different ways that we currently classify different genetic test results. And so that might be a little bit too much to try to remember. This slide, I think, is much more important. I think the important thing to understand is whenever you get genetic testing, there's really 3 possible outcomes. So the first outcome is that you receive what we call as a positive test result. And that means that when you get the genetic test, we come back and say that we were able to find a mistake in your genetic DNA that basically we feel very confident causes the disease that we were testing for. So again, this slide is for cancer, but in the case that we are talking about, it would be for cardiomyopathy. Okay, and so these would be the pathogenic or likely pathogenic variants, to put it into a more medical context for some of our practitioners and providers that are also joining. But this would be a positive test result. And you can see that on the sort of scale, this is one that we feel fairly confident, again, that the genetic change that we find, and there's lots of different metrics that are in that standard interpretation guideline paper that help us define this. But it basically says the mistake that we see, we believe is associated with the disease that we're interested in. And this is very helpful because now we can use that information to help find out about the rest of the family. We can see who else in the family may have the same marker for risk of developing cardiomyopathy, and we can test those people and make sure that they're getting the care that they need. Okay, I'm going to go to the bottom now. There's also a possibility that you get a negative test result. A negative test result in this case means that we were not able to find a mistake in your genetic material that shows what is causing cardiomyopathy in your family. So something very important to understand is that this does not mean that your child's cardiomyopathy is not caused by a genetic mistake. And it basically means that there is just a lot of limitations to the way that we understand the different genes, the different factors, and the different ways that sometimes genes and environment might play a role to cause cardiomyopathy. And so this is more a limitation of our understanding of genes and the complexity than really a fault of the test. So the test, in terms of the genes that we looked at, a lot of times it might be that if you're doing a panel, we a lot of times only look at 100 genes. So it might be a gene that's not currently on the panel. And so this is something that you want to remember, that it doesn't mean that your child's, again, cardiomyopathy is not necessarily caused by a genetic, that it's not necessarily genetic. It just means that as of the time that that testing was done, we were not able to find the genetic cause. And so that's something that you're going to want to revisit. Now, the most confusing or most complicated one for families to understand is the one in the middle. And that is basically a variant of uncertain significance. And so what that is basically, we found something that's a little bit different. It's not what we were expecting to find. So when we look at what we thought was quote unquote the normal genetic sequence, what we saw in the patient's DNA was a little bit different, but we don't know necessarily that that change is going to cause disease. And so one way to kind of think about it is there's a lot of changes in our DNA that are different from each other. And those don't necessarily always mean that those changes are associated with something that is negative or something that's going to cause a disease. It could mean that those are just the normal changes that cause our uniqueness. And it could just be one of those changes. And also these are things that may change over time. And so we have to understand that these genetic classifications are all fluid. And as we get information, they may be what we call as reclassified. And so I know that that's really confusing, and I'm happy to take questions at the end, but I just want you to understand that having a positive, again, likely pathogenic or pathogenic finding, a variant of uncertain significance, or a negative result. Negative is often your benign or likely benign findings. Those are based on data that is always changing, and so those results may change. The category that I will say will currently change the most is the variance of uncertain significance. And I'll go over some of the data to show you why it is that we know that. Okay, so this is actually now going back to our study. And so I'll go over this in a little bit more detail, but what I want you to take away, so these are actual numbers. Again, remember this was from roughly 200 patients that we looked at who had genetic testing. And so the important thing to take away is that actually 32 of the different genetic test reports got downgraded. And what we considered a downgrade was that if you moved from one of the categories on the left to one of the categories on the right. And so you can see the largest vast majority would be this category right here. And so in our particular patient group, a large number of people moved from the pathogenic or likely pathogenic category to the variant of unknown significance category. There was a much smaller number of people that got upgraded, and that was only 7 total that moved from a category on the right-hand side to a category on the left-hand side. So moving from something that was benign or a variant of unknown significance towards pathogenicity. So to summarize that in a little bit more in words, which might make a little bit more sense. So one of the important things that I want to point out, that the time from the time that the commercial test was done to the time that we looked at it, there was 7 years between that testing time. 18% of people had a change in what their variant was classified, which was a lot more than we thought it was going to be. Now, I do want you to remember that a lot of these tests were done before 2015. So that's an important cutoff that you're going to want to think of as you go back and look at your test results. 82% of those resulted in a variant downgrade. So it moving from being more pathogenic towards less pathogenic. And again, what I showed you in that graphic was that most of those were from a pathogenic or likely pathogenic or that positive category into that variant of uncertain significance or that question mark category. It was important to point out that reclassification frequency was similar across all types of cardiomyopathy. So whether the child had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated, non-compaction, we saw this similarly across all different types. I can also say that we saw this similarly across all different racial and ethnic groups. I will say that our groups were rather small, that we didn't have a lot of numbers. And so that might be a reason why we didn't see differences. There are other papers that have shown that non-whites have more reclassification, but we didn't see that in our smaller group. But we did see it similarly across all different types of cardiomyopathy, which is similar to what other people have shown. And this is what I sort of said, that upwards of 92% of these were done before the publication of the guidelines. So again, just remember that 2015 date. Okay, so I know that was a lot of science. So what did these results mean for my child? Okay, so I think it's really important to talk to your doctor if your child was tested more than 5 years ago. Okay, again, remember that 2015 date. And that doctor, depending on who you see the most often, might be your cardiologist. If your testing was done by a geneticist, you can also reach out to them. I also want to remind our families, and this is something that not everyone always remembers, that you can always reach out to the genetic testing company where your test was done. So for a lot of people, a very common test company that is used is GeneDx. There is actually a number that you can call. You can ask to speak to one of their genetic counselors there, and they're really, really helpful. I actually use them all the time. And they're just really, really great. They're there to help you, and they're there to get you to the right person. And so a lot of times they can help say, like, you know, if this is something that you need to really talk to a geneticist about. But they can always also tell you if there's been any reclassification to your child's test. So they can always look up that information for you. And then that can be information that you can then take to your next doctor's visit. And then really for more questions, a lot of times this is really complicated and it requires a lot of more careful thought and a sit down conversation. And sometimes this just requires a visit with a genetic expert and having an official consultation. I will say that the more that you can gather in terms of updating your family history, if there's been changes to that, if there's more things that you've learned, those are all helpful things when you come back in for that consultation, because that's always going to be really helpful. And so I know I only went 30 minutes, but I wanted to make sure that we had time for questions. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for your very detailed presentation today. We have now reached the question and answer component of the webinar. If you have questions for our speaker and have not done so already, you can type them into the chat or the Q&A box on the control panel of your screen, and we will read them aloud to our speaker. Please remember to keep questions to a general nature, as we cannot comment on individual cases. In the event that we run out of time, we can forward any questions to our speakers offline and return responses to you. So Dr. Lee, one of our questions we have here from a family member is, does the type of cardiomyopathy have any bearing on the recommendation for repeated genetic testing?
Yeah, no. So this basically works across all different types of cardiomyopathy. There are differences, I think, in terms of some of the tests are better in terms of picking up, I guess you can say, the yield. And so we know, like, for certain types, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is one where you tend to find an answer more commonly than not. But if you either have if you have no answer for the cause in your family, or if you have a variant of uncertain significance, those are all ones that you would want to definitely revisit. And it's generally, we say it's generally about every 5 years or so.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Another question that we have here is, what should I do if I want to learn a little bit more about a specific variant of uncertain significance, or a specific variant? Who should we talk to about that?
Yeah, so for specific variants, again, those would be ones that you would want to, you could, one, reach out to the company that did your original genetic testing report. And so you can always reach out to them. Most of them, I don't know that it's on your, hopefully you have the paper copy of your genetic test report. If not, you should be able to get that done. You should be able to get that from the doctor who did your testing. But if they don't have their number there, it's always usually on their website, and you just want to reach out to either patient support or customer services and just say that you have a specific question about your child's specific variant.
Okay, thank you. Where can we find out whether or not findings have been upgraded or downgraded for cardiomyopathy, specifically HCM?
Yeah, so again, if you have a specific variant question that you want to know, again, that is something that you can either reach out to the testing company and ask them specifically, or you can bring the test report in and show it to your doctor. You can also contact whoever did the initial genetic test report and let them know. There's rare instances where you might get a reissued test report from the genetic testing company, but I would say that that happens very infrequently.
Thank you. We have another parent who's unfortunately lost a child. The autopsy identified that the child did have cardiomyopathy. They have a small amount of this child's DNA banked, and is it something that they should look into for further testing? They have other living children and perhaps may want to have more in the future.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you lost a child. So yeah, if you have DNA banked, You can always get genetic testing done. That can be really, really helpful. That was a really smart thing that you did. And so you can always, I think the best way to start that conversation is to have a consultation. And a lot of times that can be done with reproductive genetics. And they can sit you down and they can really guide you through the whole journey, to basically try to figure out if there is a genetic cause in the baby that you lost, and then to try to figure out how they can help in terms of counseling for future children.
Okay, thank you. A similar question from another parent who sadly lost a child as well. The child was diagnosed before birth and sadly died shortly after birth. And they tested the family at the same time that they did the amniocentesis. And they said it was a de novo mutation and didn't come from the parents. Is this likely that this is something that could happen again, or how should they go about planning for another pregnancy?
Yeah, I'm so sorry also for your loss. Um, So, I mean, the good news is that most de novo variants or don't, as they sort of told you, they didn't come from either parent. There is a small percentage of those variants that can be found. Basically, what we call them is we call them germline mutations. And so, even though when we test the parents, they're not in your blood, they could be either in the sperm or the eggs. And so there's a very small percentage for that. So again, this would be something that I would refer to reproductive genetics, just so that you can, it's a very small percentage. Unfortunately, I have seen it happen. And so I just would want to make sure that you get the proper genetic counseling, and that they could, help you with understanding the potential risk and any potential screening that could be done as well. But yeah, no, reproductive, I think for anyone, I would just say, who is trying to plan for a pregnancy, and they know that they are at risk to have a child who's affected, and they have either some information and they want to get better ideas on what their risk is for a future pregnancy, and they want some planning. Reproductive genetics is really helpful. They're usually through OBGYN, maternal fetal medicine. And those are the specialists that you want to look for. They are really great at taking parents through the whole journey. Essentially, they're all obstetricians who also have genetic training. They have genetic counselors, and they can give you the whole breadth of options that are available to families. And they can really help you through the whole process. You also want to go, I think, to a center that's really specialized in terms of doing this. And so you want to start with a really specialized center that does this a lot. And then, even though you don't always have to necessarily continue your care there or have the pregnancy be followed there, but I think at least for your genetic counseling, it is really important to get the care there and at least get the genetic testing and everything validated there. And then I've had families, for example, where they've been considering doing IVF, but their IVF plan is only covered through like a local small hospital, but they've gone to a different center just to get the consultation for the genetics to make sure that the local center is at least testing for the right genes and stuff like that. Because that can get sometimes a little bit tricky, especially when it's things like de novo mutations and things like that. For example, I'll say that like I know a couple of maternal fetal medicine doctors who are really great, and they have potential like research mechanisms that they can look into to look for a couple of more rare things that wouldn't be routinely done at, for example, just an IVF center that does routine IVF. And so you might want to consider that. And then once you have all the genetic information, you can always then get, the rest of your care locally.
Great, thank you. There's another Q&A here. Maybe you could shed some light on if you know whether significant genes have been stratified further to know more about symptom severity or differences.
Yeah, so there have. So that's a conversation that I think is really important to have. A lot of times, I think there's a lot of different knowledge. And so sometimes, for example, like different cardiologists will know. There's a growing body of knowledge. For example, we know that certain genes are higher risk for having heart rhythm issues. And so for those genes, like for example, if I have patients with those, I'll change my surveillance protocol. I may involve my electrophysiologist colleagues more frequently than otherwise. So there are a growing list of genes that have different manifestations, and that, so it's what we call genotype phenotype correlations. And that's a great question to kind of, again, talk with your cardiologist about and say, like, can I, like, as you remember, my child or my family has this gene. Can we talk about, some of the new associations or what's updated? And if you're not, I would say also, if you feel like you're not getting the right answers from your cardiologist, then that's also a great time to sort of maybe reach out to a geneticist as well, because it sometimes depends on the specific expertise. And those two groups usually work really closely hand in hand. And so sometimes it takes just a little bit of collaboration between the two.
Great, thank you. Again, if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to include them in the Q&A box or even through the chat. We do have one other question here that came through. Do you recommend retesting if a sibling group has the same variant? Would you recommend retesting them all at the same time if they all have the same mutation identified?
So I always start with the person who's affected, and then I always move through the family sequentially. And so, as if the if the variant is still classified the same way for the one patient that has the disease, or if multiple kids in the family unfortunately have the disease, I always go with the one that's most severely affected. Unfortunately, it's just you get the most information from that family member, and so that's who you always want to test. But no, and then you just move sequentially. So I always do it. I tend to do it one by one. Sometimes families are like, can we just do everyone at once because it's easier? But I find it a little bit easier just to do it stepwise.
Okay, great. If anyone again has any additional questions, please feel free to put them right in the chat. Otherwise, it looks like we have reached the end of today's webinar. I don't see any more questions coming in. So again, we've reached the end of today's session. Thank you all for participating in this webinar. I wanted to again extend our thanks to Dr. Teresa Lee for joining us and for providing such a comprehensive presentation on when genetic testing should be repeated. We are very, very grateful for your time and expertise. For those who are interested in learning more about this topic, Dr. Lee's recent publication, Pediatric Cardiomyopathy, illustrates the importance of reinterpreting the significance of genetic variants, is available online through the link in the chat or by scanning the QR code that is on your screen. The recording from today's webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channel in the coming days and will also be forwarded to attendees in a follow-up email. A link to our YouTube channel at CCF Heart Kids has been placed in the chat as well. In the meantime, please feel free to reach out to us by email or connect with us on social media. Once again, thank you, Dr. Lee, for a very informative webinar explaining when genetic testing should be repeated. Thank you also to Naya Therapeutics for sponsoring today's webinar and for their generous and ongoing support of our webinar program and work at CCF. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great day.